It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you doing?
Happy to be here, as always.
Happy to welcome you. Happy to welcome columnist and communication strategist Philippe Moreau-Chevronnet.
Hello, François.
Bonne année.
Bonne année.
Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to Luke Baker, Paris bureau chief for the Reuters news agency.
Happy New Year to you too.
And Leila Jacinto, who cracks the whip at France24.com. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast, the World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. And let's begin with the word of the week. The word of the week is zen.
Order, the house must calm itself. Zen. Restraint. Patience.
70 days until Brexit, and the UK doing its best to keep calm and carry on amidst what The Economist calls on its front page the mother of all messes. The Commons rejecting the Prime Minister's Brexit divorce deal by a record 230 votes, and then voting the next day to keep Theresa May at the helm. Before we look at the mess, let's talk about that speaker for a second here, because the rest of the world, of course, paying more attention these days to proceedings in the UK Parliament, and they've really adopted John Bercow.
Well, his order has become, I think, a meme in Germany, hasn't it? They loved it. They like his style, and he sort of seems to have. You could have it as a ringtone on your phone or something. He's quite a divisive figure. He has seen, obviously, as he was sort of accused of leaning one way or the other, basically siding against the government to try and give more time and space to those who want to remain by changing the terms of the debate and the votes. That he has that right, but actually he was accused of not having followed hundreds of years of tradition, or at least 2 centuries of tradition, which has exposed him to kind of accusations of bias. And there's even suggestions that normally the Speaker would automatically get a seat in the House of Lords once he retires, and that may not happen because there is so much sort of anger and resentment towards John Bercow. But
because seen from the outside, do you think part of that popularity has to do with the fact that everybody wants to see somebody who can bring both sides together?
Well, I mean, I think most people have always seen him as someone who's a real fair arbiter of the political discourse and of the process, and actually has sought really hard to find a middle ground and to keep things on the straight and narrow. And it's just become such a divisive debate in the UK that anyone who takes, does one thing that, it's always going to be perceived by one side or the other as going against the grain or being unacceptable. So it's impossible to win for him, I think,
So here we are at the end of a week where we saw a record-breaking 230 vote margin against the Prime Minister. Yet she's still the only
118 people in her own party.
Mm-hmm.
And she's still the only game in town. And
that's to punish her, I think, is to keep her in office.
And next week there'll be Plan B, but we don't know what that will be.
They don't know either. I mean, Luke, does anybody know what Plan B? They don't know what Plan B is. And I do think there's a certain part of this that was to punish her by keeping her in office, because in fact, all the people who've been sniping at her and dragging her down, none of them actually want to be Prime Minister at this point, because there is no Plan B. Britain is headed straight for a cliff. It's about to drive off.
Or is it?
Or I think we could be in the forever waiting room of Brexit.
Well,
if you extend this so-called Article 50 and you're basically the house guest that's got his coat but never leaves.
Yeah, staying zen are the markets. The pound has actually risen the past month against the euro. And that can mean just one thing, that investors believe what Luke Baker just described, that Brussels is going to roll this over, and the drama will keep going and going and going, Philippe Moreau-Chevronnet.
Yeah, it's like a permanent situation, but we see it from France, like it may be a good thing for our domestic policies, because Macron can use this example as a warning to the French population, stating that if you want to leave the European Union, here is what could happen. It would be a dire situation, no one would win in the end, and people would lie to you in order to get your vote. And he's using it actually in order to undermine the need for a referendum in France, even undermining the
because
referendum
there's talks
process,
of more citizens'
process by
initiatives
itself.
here with the Yellow Vest movement.
Yes,
more.
and he's using the Brexit as an example of a referendum that turned bad, turned against the population. So it's convenient for us, for our domestic policies, that this example of the Brexit would exist. But we don't get, the French population doesn't get at all what's happening. Obviously, even the British don't understand it. So
I think
we're not better than the British.
Macron's explanation of Britain's sort of impossible way forward was actually very good when he was speaking to the mayors the other day. I think he laid it out very clearly. At least he has the clear understanding and seemed to have a good sense of where Britain was going to need to go, which is probably an extension of Article 50.
Lila Jacinto?
What's the question?
The question is, the prospect of this saga playing on and on at this particular point, and both sides, Labour and the Conservatives, seem to be frozen with fear, waiting for the other to make the big move.
No, absolutely. I mean, the reaching out process is too little too late now. But really, I mean, we've had a historic vote. But per se, what changed this week? Nothing really. The deal that we knew Parliament wouldn't approve did not get approved. And we're still back to status quo. Which is Theresa May still in power. But I'm sort of even more interested really in what led to this, to where we are today. And the lack, what I feel is the lack of examination of how we are. And in fact, Pankaj Mishra wrote this op-ed column in the New York Times and
Quite scathing.
Very scathing. But I have to say, this is what many post-colonials have been saying about Britain. They've never had a reckoning. They've always just carried on the hubris of their cultural notion of themselves as this great little island nation. And he actually compares what happened with partition with the subcontinent, where these absolutely incompetent elites just divided the subcontinent, and they are now doing it in the UK, except that, the country has no imperial power or money to weigh this on. How did we reach the stage where this vote happened? If Trump gets elected, the US tears itself with self-examination. At no stage are we hearing that much of a discourse about we are European. It's all about, capitalism. We're not going to end up better than we are, the trade deals that were promised. What is the ideals? It just doesn't seem to be the case.
How true is that stereotype, Luke Baker, that the Oxbridge elite rewards more sort of flair and daring do than it does competence?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, stereotypes all have a strong and heavy element of truth about them. And I think, in Britain, it's kind of been the case that a large number of prime ministers went to Eton and went to Oxford and basically do things by the seat of your pants, winging it, i.e. doing it at the last minute, is considered kind of a skill. People say that if you get a degree in PPE at Oxford, it's all about winging it. So there is a certain amount of that mentality, and it's very much embodied by Boris Johnson and to an extent some others. Of course, it is a stereotype. There's a great deal of very serious government and what's the word? People working behind the scenes in administration. The civil service is extremely strong and rigorous. But effectively, we've had Britain in a state of affairs since David Cameron called the election, which has left it looking like shambolic and unsure of itself. The mask has fallen, the sense of this, a country that once sort of spanned the globe, unable to really know what it wants, where it's going to go, what it wants from the European Union, and thinking in some dreamy fashion that it can sign, trade deals around the world overnight, and yet actually none of that's been done. It's just not prepared for what will be the biggest, most monumental cliff edge that it's faced, in centuries. Speaking
of cliff edges, across the channel, we're watching closely. France's Prime Minister this Friday could see Britain from the northern port of Calais. Edouard Philippe taking no chances, announcing a raft of measures to prepare for a no-deal Brexit, including a one-year exemption so UK expats here in France can sort out residency permits and a shoring up of the borders.
We've taken the decision to start a €50 million investment plan in all French harbors and airports, which are the locations which will be most directly impacted by the consequences of a no-deal Brexit.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, is France ready for Brexit?
Very much so, yes. In Paris, we're waiting for the arrival, incoming of maybe 1,000 bankers, very wealthy people that will even rise the prices further up. So we are excited about that.
If you live in Paris.
If you live in Paris, it's a disaster because the prices will go up for real estate, for food, for everything. Because really, they are coming. I mean, the Barclays is sending actually more than 1,000 people here. So it's like banks are relocating their top executives to Paris. And we see a lot of guys that went from Paris to London coming back because, they are not in the EU anymore. And the big contracts they had with companies, European companies, are falling apart if they are not in the EU. The big groups, big corporations want only EU contracts. So they are leaving the Britain and they are coming back to France. And we see that happening all the time.
By the way, not everyone in Calais rooting against Brexit. Some say they have a vested interest, in fact, in the opposite.
We would like Brexit to bring a return to duty-free. We had some great years with duty-free, with Brits coming to buy tax-free items. It created jobs.
Is it going to be back to the past, Christopher?
Well, I think in some ways, it'll be worse than the past because people have gotten used to these relatively open borders. There's a certain kind of schadenfreude here, too, because you get so used to the idea that when you go from the EU, where you're used to traveling everywhere in the Schengen area, all of a sudden you're going to Britain and they've got to have your passport checked and there are all these issues, and that's before Brexit. Well, now the Brits can feel the same way when they come to France. They can be in a situation where, we don't really want you very much. We don't really think we need you very much. And you're going to have to jump through some hoops to get into the Schengen area and get into Europe. And I say, fine.
Do you say fine?
Take that, Luke.
Oh, no, absolutely. most certainly. And what's going to happen on the Irish border?
Well, that's where it's going to come. That's where it's going to come to a crunch.
I mean, literally, these divisions that they have wrecked through history are coming home to roost.
And yet we come back to, again, the question at the outset, which is this really all still going to happen? I know it's 10 weeks away, but they're going to hit the pause button probably, and then it gets rolled over, and then what happens?
Well, there's only really two things that can happen. One is that May find some way of amending her deal with other partners and can put it back to a vote in Parliament, but that's also got to be approved if it does change. The withdrawal agreement that's been struck with the EU, if it is fundamentally changed from one side, it has to be agreed with the EU again, or the EU comes forward and says, there are certain areas that we can make adjustments on, and we can agree that, and you put that back to a vote. But I also see that as being very unlikely. I see this ante-room, this forever holding on in sort of suspended animation, waiting for Brexit to happen, looking more likely than anything else at this point, which is it might be supportive for the economy and sterling because people feel like that's better than no deal, which everyone has pretty much said is not going to happen. But even if they're going to have an extension of what's called Article 50, they've got to take some pretty quick decisions on that. And it's got to get the support of the UK Parliament for it to happen.
Oh, dear. So we have to keep discussing this.
Yeah. It'll go on.
I know, that's the way I feel.
It's just enough.
Enough.
Basta.
Yeah, basta.
We'll have more on that next week. As the UK ponders its exit from the European Union, the United States preparing for its exit from northeast Syria. And we've seen now the first attack of its scale since Donald Trump's surprise announcement of a month ago, a suicide bombing in Manbij near the Turkish border. 19 killed, including 4 U.S. nationals, 2 soldiers and 2 civilian contractors. The attack attributed to Islamic State militants. And yet, Thursday, the U.S. Vice President staying on message in a speech at the State Department in Washington.
Thanks to the leadership of this Commander-in-Chief and the courage and sacrifice of our armed forces, we're now actually able to begin to hand off the fight against ISIS in Syria to our coalition partners, and we are bringing our troops home. The caliphate has crumbled and ISIS has been defeated.
He makes the speech the day after this attack.
Well, look, are you suggesting that this administration should be in contact with facts, with reality? No. This is like everything else this administration does. This is an effort to convince people of things that they want to believe. The administration wants to believe that ISIS has been defeated. That's politically useful. Trump said he would do it. Nobody else but he could do it. Pence is, in lockstep with Trump on this. It doesn't matter if it's true. In fact, it's very dangerous to think that it's true because you let down your defenses, you pull the troops out of Syria, you create a situation where there's going to be even more chaos in Syria, and you open up a very big space for the remnants of ISIS to grow again. But, you're going to keep telling your base it's all okay.
And this attack, I mean, it's really, what is the U.S. forces there going to be doing? They are now focused on pulling out. Mm-hmm. They're going to have a smaller force there, which increases the risk of the forces left behind. This is exactly what was bound to happen. So we've got now U.S. soldiers, smaller force, at greater risk in that area in this period. Forget about the long-term consequences, which are, we can go on.
And you, as always, you have to ask yourself who ultimately gains from the US withdrawing from there. And there are a number of groups that do. Russia gains to a certain extent. The Turks gain because they want to control that portion in northern Syria along the border. Well, ultimately, they will go after the Kurds in that area. And they feel that they're restricted in going after the Kurds, who have been a US ally because of the US presence there. So in a way, it frees the Turkish administration to go after Kurds in northern Syria. But frankly, it does nothing to bring greater stability to Syria or to defeat Islamic State. And the idea that the caliphate has crumbled is just ludicrous.
All right, we're going to pick up on those points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24. A different take on the news.
In Japan, hundreds of thousands of people spend their entire lives in their bedrooms, never leaving their apartments, unable to face life outside. They are known as the hikikomori. Some manage to overcome their fears, others never do. Reporters, see it on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume The World This Week, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Authorities in Colombia blame the rebel ELN for the worst terror attack there in 15 years. The driver identified in the bombing of a police academy in Bogota. 21 killed, one accomplice arrested. Donald Trump accuses his former personal attorney of lying to reduce his jail time. According to BuzzFeed, Michael Cohen claims the president told him to lie to Congress about a 2016 real estate project. Authorities in Kinshasa rebuked the African Union for its call to postpone the final definitive presidential election results. The Constitutional Court expected to rule on the opposition's appeal against the surprise provisional tally. Algerian authorities set April 18th as the date for a presidential election, raising odds. The country's wheelchair-bound president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, will seek a fifth term. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. Welcome back as well to a columnist and communication strategist Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet. Yep. And with us as well, Luke Baker, Paris bureau chief for the Reuters news agency, and from France24.com, Lila Jacinto. We were talking about what's going to happen in northeast Syria after the U.S.'s departure, and we heard Mike Pence, the U.S. Vice President, saying it was full steam ahead. Well, as Pence was speaking Thursday, Emmanuel Macron, France's president, addressing his New Year's greetings to the French armed forces.
We will remain militarily engaged in Iraq and Syria with the international coalition for the coming year. We will adapt our global military stance for this situation, but any rush to withdraw would be a mistake.
Fine words, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, but what more can France do if the US really does scale back?
Pretty much nothing. We have been trying to influence the US foreign policy for several months. Emmanuel Macron tried to pose as the guy who could rein in Donald Trump, who could really calm him, bring him to reason, could influence him in some way. And it's been demonstrated that he couldn't. And even the French president actually has been humiliated by Trump very recently at several occasions. So we don't have any influence on what Trump could do. The real politic that Trump is playing is really harsh on his partners. Or we don't even know if we are still partners with the US.
I mean, I think that's the key point, is that Trump has become an incredibly unreliable ally. I mean, the worst position in the world to be in right now is to be an ally of the United States under Donald Trump. It's not, we're all talking about Europe, we're talking about the Middle East. We've been writing in the Daily Beast quite a bit about what's going on in Korea right now. It looks like Trump is getting ready to pull troops out of Korea, possibly a lot of troops.
This as we have the North Korean envoy visiting the Oval Office.
Absolutely. And Kim Jong-un has wanted a deal where we declare peace, you take your troops out, and I'll make a few concessions on denuclearization.
Which he wants the U.S. to do as well.
Which he wants the U.S. to do as well. It's a crazy situation, but Trump is going to be desperate for a deal. One, among other things, is going to want to distract from all this Russia news. So there's a real risk that he's going to cut a deal in a summit probably next month with Kim Jong-un, in which he says, I'm bringing peace to Korea, and we're pulling the troops out of Korea.
How does it work in the United States? Does the Pentagon just follow orders when the president says, when the commander-in-chief?
Ultimately, they do, or they resign, and that Secretary of Defense James Mattis did, because they just can't stomach it. This is, if you are a soldier, especially if you're a ranking general in the defense establishment, you look at the rest of the world and you say, we need allies. We need the force multiplier that they represent. We need them for deterrent effect. You need allies for all kinds of reasons. What Trump believes is that people should pay the United States to defend them. You know, all this stuff about burden sharing, it's bull. He doesn't believe in burden sharing. He believes in the mercenary philosophy of soldiering. You pay me to defend you. You buy my arms. That's what he wants from NATO. That's what he wants from South Korea. That's what he wants. Where does he get it? He gets it from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are very used to hiring mercenaries, and so they've hired Donald Trump.
Of course, there are checks and balances in Washington. This Friday, one of the most influential Republican senators, Lindsey Graham, in Turkey, where he was expected to discuss the creation of a safe zone in northern Syria with the Turkish president. Jacinto, what's going to happen concretely at the border there?
Well, concretely, whatever happens with safe zone is always the opposite. It turns out to be a very unsafe zone. You know, Turkey has been wanting this buffer zone, but this buffer zone is in an area that is got a Kurdish majority, or very large sections of the Kurdish population. The Kurdish groups who are not going to submit to Turkey securing this area. So it's going to be insecure. If there are no U.S. troops coordinating this, that, you know, we are looking at a very dangerous situation there. And this includes, you know, other minorities, because this part of Syria is full of minorities. There are Christian minorities there. So, you know, I do not really think that Turkey is going to come out that much stronger with this U.S. troop pullout. I mean, Turkey is definitely the junior partner in its relationship with Russia. There are other Arab states, other Sunni Arab states that would prefer to actually deal with Assad because they, in order to calm Iran, which they see as the real problem. And, you know, Arabs have a historical problem with the Turks, who were the Ottomans. So, I mean, Turkey's position is seriously undermined over here. And, you know, the military is not going to be able to manage this. And I really genuinely do not know how Erdogan is going to manage the situation. He will, of course, win the next municipal election coming up because he knows how to play the democratic game. But the Turkish military is not going to be able to cope with the situation.
By the way, blame Erdogan for my beloved New York Knicks' 1-point loss to Washington. There was an NBA match played Thursday in London. That's because outspoken Knicks Turkish center Enes Kanter refused to make the trip. He's been the subject of threats and an extradition request by Ankara, all because of his outspoken views on press freedom and the current crackdown on dissent.
I feel like, Trump definitely should talk about these issues with what's going on in Turkey, because there are lots of reports out there that people are being getting kidnapped, getting tortured in jail, and, just getting killed.
Luke Baker?
Well, I mean, it's, it seemed for a while, if Turkey, from what I understand, Turkey hasn't made a formal request for this red notice. They wanted Enes Kuntur, right? They wanted him to be extradited. It seems to be a little bit of playing games and raising threats. But the very fact that things like that, which that's another kind of debate, but I mean, they're using Interpol to try and score political points and try to sort of and get a basketball player extradited from the United States to Turkey on some sort of trumped up grounds is frankly absurd. But it's a sort of thing that now happens in a world where no one really wants to apply the kind of accepted liberal world, rules-based game.
Well, there are thousands of Turkish citizens who have this same fear. This is a Knicks player. And, so he's got some standing. But there are many Turkish people who are living this nightmare, really. And all courage. I mean, I'm a Knicks fan anyway. This man has faced death threats. He hasn't seen his family since 2015. His family is inside Turkey, facing. I mean, he cannot even text his family. They do not have access to computers and to their cell phones, because he says that one text message and his family is in danger. So, I mean, this is the reality of so many Turkish citizens living outside Turkey.
Leila Jacinta, I want to ask you, in Nairobi this week, scenes reminiscent of the Westgate Mall siege. It left 67 dead over 4 days. This time around, 5 gunmen storming an upscale hotel and office complex in the Kenyan capital. 21 killed, as well as all of the assailants. Once again, Somalia's Al-Shabaab militias claiming responsibility. Now, you covered the Westgate Mall attack for France 24. Your thoughts on this attack?
I tell you, François, I was very heartened to see the security response a lot better this time than during the Westgate attack. That was an utter mess. It was the special forces, the special police forces that moved in, and we have a much lower death toll, and the situation was calm. Having said that, this also underscores how perennially insecure this place is. I mean, Al-Shabaab has taken a hit with U.S., especially U.S. drone strikes in the area. But this underscores how difficult it is really to keep the security situation in a city like Nairobi intact. And Al-Shabaab can use any pretext. The old pretext was there are Kenyan troops in Somalia. And there are Kenyan troops in Somalia. But even if Kenyan troops withdraw from Somalia, they still look at Nairobi as the place to make a media splash. And every time they do it, it's not so much how many civilians they manage to kill, is so much as where they manage to target. And, this riverside, this whole estate has embassies near it. It has a lot of internationals. And so this is really a call by Al-Shabaab saying, look, we're still around, and it doesn't take a lot for us to mount these kind of attacks.
The interesting little element of this story, leaving aside the attack itself was dreadful, but the reaction of some photos that were published by the New York Times, and there was a huge outpouring of anger from Kenyans online on Twitter, sort of demanding that these photos were pretty graphic, showing the attack in one area of that complex. And I found that kind of interesting because I think there's this sense of, lives in Africa or in Kenya and these attacks being sort of somehow cheapened by being shown and put it on the front page of the newspapers, and it was really full-on kind of reaction. So you see this kind of also a kind of this anger that comes out on social media that's really aimed at sort of the way that a perception in Kenya that the West perceives them somehow as sort of cheaper and not so valued. Yeah.
The use of attacks as a PR stunt by terrorists is always it's always happening in Kenya. I mean, it's because it's an entry point to all the English-talking media. So it's like we use Kenya as a way to reach the global media system. It's very efficient. We saw that a lot in Paris too. But it's we kind of managed to put it down a little bit. I mean, hopefully.
He's not out of jail, but Ivory Coast's former president has been cleared of genocide charges in a case that some see as maybe even the death knell for the International Criminal Court as we currently know it. Laurent Gbagbo and his youth wing leader Charles Blé accused over the post-electoral violence in 2010-2011 that left 3,000 dead. The defense was so sure of itself that it waived its right to call witnesses. The judges who were scathing when they addressed the prosecution.
There is no need for the defense to submit further evidence, as the prosecutor has not satisfied the burden of proof in relation to several core constitutive elements of the crimes as charged.
So how do you do it, Christopher Dickey? How do you make an international criminal court where the prosecution isn't perceived to be political, where justice appears to be blind?
Well, I think we have to start by asking whether Gbagbo really was guilty of these things. I mean, is it conceivable that, in fact, they couldn't make the case because there wasn't enough evidence to nail him on it? I mean, once you get into the courtroom in a case like this, and the charge is something as dramatic as genocide, then it's not being tried in the press. It is being tried in the court. It is being tried in a situation where you do have to offer proof. Now, I confess, it's not a case that I followed very closely, but it seems to me that we are assuming that he was guilty and that this is completely screwed up because he was found innocent. It may be that they just didn't, the research that was done and the evidence that was gathered was simply insufficient for the prosecution to do better.
That evidence gathering often secondhand, Leo Jacinto, and that's one of the criticisms that's been leveled at the court, that the prosecution doesn't have its own FBI as such, or its own police force, because this is a supranational jurisdiction.
Right, as we saw in the case in Kenya as well. I mean, and in both cases, we have the judges saying the prosecution did a terrible job. So the subtext of it is not that they were not guilty. The subtext of it is that this case was very poorly argued. I mean, and the fundamental problem could also be, you know, what are the requirements to show direct responsibility? And if this court cannot show direct responsibility to the leaders who call for these mass killings, you know, we're talking now about a situation where there is a deep fear of unrest in Ivory Coast. And you know, Francois, you've been in Ivory Coast, about what a tinderbox this situation is. How can these prosecutions not come up with a strong enough case? Forget about Laurent Gbagbo. We are talking about Charles Blé. You know, this is a man who's called the General of the Streets. He went around with the flag of the Ivory Coast around his neck. They did not even manage to launch an arguable, persuasive case in the case of Blé as well. So I think the ICC really needs to...
But murderers go free all the time in American courts, French courts, British courts. These things happen when you don't have sufficient investigative powers and you can't make the connections that you're describing. That's the frustration. We can all know something, everybody knows it, but how do you prove it in a court?
From what I haven't, the little I've been reading about this case, one thing, I think one piece of evidence they were trying to introduce was a speech that Gbagbo had made to suggest that this had incited sort of, others to rise up in sort of, in attacks. Now, it's very difficult to tie, there may have been coded language in his speech, there may have been people that understood it in certain ways that sort of led them to carry out attacks, but it's extremely difficult to tie the words of one man in a speech to specific attacks. And if that were to happen, if they were to be successful, it really opens a can of worms.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag world this week. This one, the liberation of Laurent Gbagbo paves the way for a definitive reconciliation for the Ivorian people. That's certainly the opinion of his spouse, the former First Lady herself, amnestied a few months back.
The Ivory Coast has been on a march towards national reconciliation for a while. Today, I would say a central figure of this national reconciliation has been freed and acquitted. He will now be able to play his part in the entire reconciliation of the nation.
First of all, he has been spending 7 years in jail. So if he's innocent, it's a very long time, right? The debate is all about, does the court have the power, enough investigative powers because the human rights activists have been stunned by the decision, obviously. But we could see on the other hand that maybe they had enough investigative powers and they just decided that there was not enough clues, as it has been said. And it's a way maybe to reconcile the people in Ivory Coast, because we all know that, you know, this kind of truth and reconciliation, you can tell the truth, not condemn people, and get kind of political rest, because, you know, that's the way to do it. We did that in South Africa. We did a lot of that kind of process, maybe forgiving sometimes, even all the more when you don't have enough evidence.
But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in
politically,
South Africa,
I mean, what I mean is politically it doesn't sound stupid to say.
It had more of a backbone. They had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Ivory Coast. Didn't seem to have much of a backbone, and many complaining that the whole process of reconciliation needs to come with the process of justice, and that.
Yeah, but you always want to behead the king because he is the king, right? That's enough.
No, it is the argument made.
That's not because he is the king that
sides.
is responsible for everything. And maybe the court has done justice. If we don't believe in the court anymore, then we will start the process of distracting the court. So it's a huge responsibility to think of.
But the problem was that President Ouattara granted an amnesty to Simon Gbagbo, who was tried in the Ivory systems. You know, so as you said, you need to have a whole process, not just have an amnesty.
Yeah. Finally, nothing wrong with one glass of wine. That's what my doctor says, insisting it should be treated as a condiment, 1 glass a day. France's agriculture minister, well, he seems more liberal in his views.
No, I don't think that wine is like other alcohol. Alcohol addiction is very serious, most notably with youth and binge-drinking culture. But I have never seen a young person who exits a nightclub and is drunk because they drank a Côte du Rhône, a Gros Hermitage, a Bordeaux, or a Costière de Nîmes. Never.
Jamais.
Yeah, because it's too expensive for you. Otherwise, they would drink the wine.
Especially the Gros Hermitage. I mean,
if you want to put Gros Hermitage to use, please do it. Try it as a test. I think they will drink it and they will love it.
Hang on. Among those up in arms over this,
it's an old white man. I mean, he doesn't know what he's saying. He's trying to protect the lobby. In France, we have a huge lobby for the wine. Yeah. And we need to defend it in a way because it's been attacked on all sides by the US, by China, by everyone, and we need to protect our market, obviously, but that's not the way to do it.
Yeah, an important point. This is not the health minister speaking; it's the agricultural minister.
Yeah, but he should talk to the
because I think
minister.
the health minister did say, did she not, that you need to kind of limit your intake. And France, I think, does have among the highest proportions of red wine consumption in the world, which kind of seems natural to me. I think Macron's even said that he drinks 2 glasses of wine a day, which I frankly can't believe. But I think he wants to appeal to the broader French public.
The higher ratio of alcohol to people, the higher ratio is in Vatican City, by the way, because of that's true, because of diplomatic relations. We hope.
I thought Eucharistic wine.
No, listen, you want to go to a place where people really get popped. Go to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, any of the countries that ban alcohol. And there, people drink like fish. It's unbelievable.
Hard liquor.
And hard liquor.
Right.
Yeah. The idea is to get as drunk as you can, as quick as you can.
Now, Philippe's saying that
they don't drink a lot of wine.
Philippe's saying that those wines, the reason young people don't drink those wines is because they're too expensive.
It's a cultural thing.
Among those up in arms over these remarks is the vice president of France's National Association for the Prevention of Alcoholism and Addiction. And he brought out in a tweet statistics that show 18% of the young do use wine and 25% champagne.
Very cheap champagne.
I was going to say, we've had the yellow vest movement, but it seems like maybe today's youth has more money than we first thought.
No, you've got every kind of champagne. You can have very cheap champagne if you want. Go to your next door store. You will find champagne very cheap, but that's not real champagne, man. It's not. When he's talking about Côte du Rhône and Gros Hermitage, he doesn't think about that kind of cheap liquor. He's thinking that, okay, it's kind of a social, it's a Macron thing, okay? They don't hear themselves when they talk, but it's like despising all the guys that don't drink Côte du Rhône or Gros Hermitage. It's like saying, we drink the good stuff. That's not alcohol. These guys, these beasts, they get drunk on cheap things that they shouldn't be drinking. But we will teach them how to drink properly. I mean, it's
at least it looks a little
it's
classy.
immensely despising.
If the youth are getting drunk on champagne and Crozamital, it has a little class to it at least. They're not drinking alcopops like in the UK.
Yes,
and kind of,
it's a question of class.
They are
Exactly my point.
And that's exactly what he's talking about.
It's a question of class.
Lila Jacinto, the nation that once used to serve wine in high schools, once more, the fact that people are outraged, showing that France is becoming, well, a little more like the rest of the world.
Probably. I mean, they're taking their health seriously, but it's also, you know, bashing a minister for saying a very stupid thing.
All right.
Yeah,
well,
sure. Yeah, I think he was drunk. No,
it was on breakfast radio, so I hope not.
He had a little Calvados, actually, for the starter.
Philippe Chevrolet, I want to thank you. I want to thank Lila Jacinto, Christopher Dickey, Luke Baker. Stay with us because Media Watch is next.